I know we're live on Zoom recorded, so thank you for everybody that's here today. If you're here for the Grand Rounds on the internet, we're doing a simultaneous recording on Zoom, as well as having our net on 20 meters. So there is no web stream today. No web stream since our gracious member who records them every weekend and puts them on the air live as well as recorded. Chip N5 RTF is in Dallas to see the eclipse. I hope many of you will also see the eclipse. I'm looking at Barry. I know he's in the totality window here. I'm looking at Barry on Zoom on the screen. I also know that Dave at KM2M in Buffalo, who's here with us today, is also in the total eclipse. I think we're about 60% here. I'm not sure what Jerry is in South Florida. I'm looking down the list. I guess El Paso, Bernie, you'll get quite a bit, if not totality, in KD5QHV, and perhaps during your president's report, you can comment on that. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to the president for his introductory comments, KD5QHV. Bernie, go ahead and take the mic.
If you would go ahead and check one in, if you're sitting right here with me. Good morning, one and all on the net. I think 87%. 85% on the eclipse on Monday. We're looking forward to that. Talking with Jeff down there. For those of you that it's a great place to go. So, don't forget, in a month we're going to Virginia and Dayton. And the annual meeting, the Zoom meeting, we'll be looking forward to seeing you either in person. Zoom. And that's the one that's been quite nice, other than the fact that it's been blowing 50 miles an hour most days. But it's pretty fun.
Okay, thank you very much, Bernie. And we look forward to spending time with you next month. For those that are listening, if you haven't made your reservation for a hotel room, we still have our block open for another week. So all that information is in the ether. And if you'd like to join us at the convention, join us for the trip to the museum, Air Force Museum of the United States. We're going to have a wonderful time. And as it was just mentioned here by Bernie, we're going to have a Zoom meeting for our annual meeting. So it will be Wednesday night, and we'll be out, 3 or 4 of us, Keith and Barry and myself, and Bernie will be together in Dayton for that. But yeah, all the other members are welcome to join in by Zoom. We're separating it out from the Friday and Saturdays that we usually take care of the business meeting. This gives everybody that's in Dayton an opportunity to participate directly at Hamvention without that extra burden, and it allows us to get over there and man our booth earlier. So a little bit of change in the modus operandi. Let me turn it over to our president-elect, Barry, WB1FFI.
In Syracuse, New York. As Jay mentioned, we are in the zone of totality tomorrow at approximately 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, plus or minus. But unfortunately, because it is Syracuse, we do have a lot of clouds, and I don't know if we can get a clear view of the eclipse. So that would be unfortunate since these events are so rare. But we'll just see how it goes. I have my eclipse glasses, and I'm all set. But if it's really cloudy, it'll be dark, but won't be quite dramatic. And of course, we can see it on other video feeds and so forth, but it's nice to see it for oneself. Nothing else to report, really. Just echoing Bernie's sentiments. Hoping as many people as possible willing to make the trip to Dayton. So look forward to seeing a reasonable group of people there. As Jay said, there's hotel rooms available, and we'd like to see a good contingent of Marco members for eyeball CUSOs, although the meeting will be on Zoom. So one last thing, actually two last things, Jay. One is just a reminder about our disclaimer about giving medical advice on our health. I know that we have that in our ether. We just want to make sure we echo it on our on the air net. And just a question on the Zoom. I noticed that my picture on the Zoom is a mirror image, and I wonder if there's any way to flip it. Because it's pretty funny things on stuff that's written. So just a query about that. So let's see, J4FL, WB1FFI.
Yes, WB1FFI, AA4FL. Funny you mentioned that. I'm also mirrored. So I guess it's the way the world sees us, not the way we see ourselves. I don't really know if there's a way to do that. If anybody else knows the answer to that question, I'll pause for a minute for a comment. Sorry, I don't have any additional information. Barry, it's a good observation in question, especially we have something in print here. It's important to see. Now, this is AA4FL Secretary for the Medical Amateur Radio Council, the net control for today, as well as the presenter. We do have a simultaneously, as my secretary's report, a simultaneous Zoom presentation. So if you're listening and you're a Marco member and you're a member of our Google group, you should have received the link for the Zoom presentation. So we're hybridizing the meeting today, recording the Zoom session. And hopefully that will open up the net to a wider audience. There's members that can't hear us in 20 meters. There's also church conflicts for many members. And this gives us a chance to record it. Usually we have a web stream running. For those of you that are expecting the web stream, it's not going today, and this is substituting. You have to bring up the Zoom meeting live. And Barry made a very important point about the medical subject and the disclaimer. We're talking about artificial sweeteners, their science, medical risks, manufacture, and adulteration. The comments that you'll hear today are through the lens of individual members, the perception of the subject matter. It's not medical advice. It's not professional advice. This is a net for just discussion, open to the general public. Obviously, many of us that are members of Marco, not exclusively, are professionals in the health field. And when you have varied individuals from different fields, dentistry, medicine, pharmacy, for example, you have a different lens that you're viewing the world through. And that's very pertinent to discussions such as this time from individual perspectives. But please don't take it as medical advice, because it's not. It's just helpful discussion and the science behind it. In this particular presentation, when I go ahead and share the screen, you'll see that there's lots of hypertext. We share our research notes, we publish them in our Ether publication, and we do offer the science behind it, but we allow our members to self-select the depth that they would like to inquire, and we give a summary of the discussion that we're having. So it's very consumable, and I hate to use that term because we're talking about dietary consumption today, but it is digestible to the general public, pun intended. That being said, I don't see that we have a report from net control today, and I don't think we need one from Treasury. So we'll go ahead and proceed here to our program. I'm going to pause one for any additional check-ins before I do. AA4FL, bear mounds in the air net, looking for check-ins. Make your call to AA4FL. Okay, we'll periodically pause for that. I'm going to start to share the screen here, and on HF, I'll give you guys a chance to comment if you're still copying me. Let me share the video I'm going to be using. Okay, this is the presentation that we have running. So I know a few of you are on. Barry, WB1FFI, are you still hearing me properly and seeing the text on the screen for the presentation? Go ahead, Barry.
The Zoom meeting, I'm listening to you over the air very clearly, and I do see the material in the Zoom myself.
Okay, QSL, thank you. And Keith, M3IM, do you happen to have the Zoom audio up? Is it up and running for you? AA4 up?
Yes, I do, very much so. Did you copy?
Go ahead and let me know on HF if you would.
I'm talking very nice, but the presentation
Okay, thank you, Keith. We'll go ahead now and everybody would mute on Zoom. We're going to go ahead and start the presentation here. And as you can see, it's targeted for the grand rounds in the air, and these are the research notes. So I spent a day going through some of the most current science and have a summation. Trying to get a practical consideration on artificial sweeteners, their science, medical risks, manufacture, and the adulteration of. And it's interesting in going through this particular presentation how pertinent it is to recent grand rounds of the year's discussions that we've had on honey and chocolate, even on olive oil in a way, because when we talk about the food chain and we talk about the way that we're presented foods that are manufactured foods, processed foods, some of these issues that come up as to what causes what, they're all interrelated. So you can refer to the hypertext links in this article as it will be distributed in the Marco Google group. I think we've already sent it to a few, but it will also be in the ether. If anybody wants a copy of this, just email me at my QRZ address if you're not a member of Marco, and I will send you the research notes. But that way you'll be able to use the hypertext links for source material and further details. So, it's interesting going through this because many of us that were born prior to 1916, you may remember the beginnings in terms of industry of artificial non-nutritive sweeteners starting to appear in the news as not only in industry, but also as potential health risks with the early discussion about cyclamates is what I remember. I was an unusual child at the time. I was pretty chubby, still am pretty chubby. But part of the issue for that at the time was the sugared cereal that targeted young people. I guess I was very sensitive to it. I was an overconsumer of it. My family wasn't very attuned to the risks. And who knows how much of the health implications through obesity started to, and whether or not the neurochemistry of my brain was affected by that. As a 5 or 6 year old watching cartoons every Saturday morning with targeted advertising. And there's a link somewhere on this page that talks about that particular product. But even then, there was demand for alternatives to sucrose, for table sugar. And, there's also high fructose corn syrup, the sweeteners, for other reasons. It always wasn't about obesity and weight. They partially addressed some of the concerns for this need, but society and culture still provides an intense demand for products that are sweetened using artificial sweeteners. And the use in food industry started, of course, way back in the 1800s. It wasn't just here recently. So you've got alternative sweeteners. Some of them are non-nutritive. Some of them are naturally occurring. Some of them are synthetic. And we'll be talking about that today. And life is complicated. You can't just say that there's causation from one particular aspect of the food chain, but the excessive sugar consumption of modern culture has adverse effects in a complicated metabolic scenario as it creates high blood sugar and glucose levels for long periods. So obviously that can contribute to other issues that develop of glucose intolerance and insulin resistance over time, and the extra energy that's produced by all that sugar in your bloodstream being converted into storage of excess energy, which is also converted into body fat. And complicating the issue is the affordability of high carbohydrate foods. So, obviously it's expensive to buy healthy foods that are free of a lot of the processing. And it's nice that the general public has low-cost alternatives for foods. It certainly allows individuals to get their calories in, but you can see that with that affordability issue, you might find that this is considered a public epidemic in some segments of Western society. And we'll look at some of the charts and some of the impacts of that. But the sucrose in the diet are not just sucrose or table sugars, but we also have free sugars, the monosaccharides, the disaccharides. Of course, are added by the food, by the manufacturers or restaurants or consumer or industry. But it also includes sugars that are naturally present in honey, syrups, fruit juices, fruit juice concentrations. Those are also additives. And the glycemic index of natural sugars can be viewed through a link we have here. Diets with foods that have a high glycemic index or load that lead to high blood glucose levels are strongly associated with the onset of type 2 diabetes. This, again, a complicated interaction of many aspects of the food chain. And we're talking about carbohydrates, we're talking about glycemic indexes, we're talking about the load there, sugar load. So even flour and other aspects, anybody that's had diabetes or special diet knows it's not all about sugar. But what are some of the problems? What are some of the issues that we see? As a substitute, non-nutritive sweeteners have an already higher than caloric intensity, higher than caloric nutritive sweeteners. They're very, very sweet. So what does that mean in practicality? Because their potency might be 200 to 20,000 times greater than sucrose, as you can see from the research notes here. And I'm, of course, deviating from the notes as well, as this is just a guideline. But in terms of weight control, the use is to reduce the caloric or sugar intent of foods, but other applications include the management of diabetes through substitution in the diet. And do we need to consider balancing the potential adverse risks of these artificial non-nutritive sweeteners against those from the use of sucrose and other natural sweeteners? Again, this is a complicated scenario. It's a trade-off. And I think Jerry N4TSC in our earlier digital net reminded us that moderation is the rule of the day, common sense. So we can talk about all the science we want. And, when I talked about earlier about perhaps being exposed to sugar at a young age. So we're talking about neurobiological effects of these things too. And just because something is sweet, do we really know, is it the sweetness that causes that neurological response? Is it the sweetness regardless of the sweetener, whether it's natural or artificial, that's causing, perhaps an addiction to these products or the demand in the body for these products? Or is it the actual sweetener itself that's causing these? Are all complicated questions. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. I'm going to let it pause one here for any late check-ins. Make your call to AA4FL. This is the Grand Rounds in the Air Medical Amateur Radio Council. Grand Rounds in the Air Net, open to all amateurs. Make your call to AA4FL.
A3, Mike Fox Bravo.
Okay, Whiskey 3, Mike Fox Bravo. Thank you for being here with us today, Mike. Any additional check-ins? Okay, Keith M3IM, would you put out a CQ marker, please?
CQ marker, CQ marker, CQ marker. This is the Medical Amateur Radio Council Sunday net. Can you check in? Please call M3IM at this time.
Okay, thank you, Keith. No additional check-ins. We'll check again a little later on as propagation changes. And certainly those of you that are listening but maybe aren't on Zoom, we are simultaneously having a Zoom session for our members. And it will be recorded. So for those of you that are not Marco members, if you'd like to obtain the recording later or these research notes, just email me directly, AA4FL, my QRZ address. So as we talk about the sweeteners, the Food and Drug Administration assures us the safe use of many different artificial sweeteners, yet with evidence and perceptions of harmful outcomes. So one aspect we can look at is inflammation of the bowels. Can it be connected historically? According to one source, it was because they felt the IBD or the incidence of bowel disease prevalence started in the early 1990s in Canada, the US, and England, and it happened to coincide with sucralose and saccharin becoming common ingredients in the food supply. Of course, its use as a potential cause of intestinal distress is a complicated subject because there's so many variables and nutrients. I mean, think about what else has happened in the food industry that time. Everyone can relate to that. Perhaps some of you have had problems processing some of these foods. I mean, why did they develop fats like cholesterol? Why did they develop sugar alcohols like ones in non-sugar candy for diabetics? I mean, those are just a few examples. What about high-fat snack foods that they developed? Doesn't that also correlate quite commonly since the 1990s? I mean, it's a multidisciplinary consideration. It can't be blamed on any one, but it's still an observation. There'll be a chart on the next page that actually tries to make that correlation in terms of the artificial sweeteners. But again, that seems to be very complicated. And there's plenty of considerations for using substitutes for sugar, of course. But what does the food industry do? I mean, is this commercialized? You can manufacture the products. It's a commercial endeavor. There's certainly a consumer audience for it. You're going to satisfy them through taste, but ultimately, you have to have a continued desire for the products. If you look at that philosophy of consumption, I'm thinking of maybe Theodore Adorno. I think he wrote a whole book on that. It's a common trend, whether it be record albums and music and the way music is produced, or foods. It has to appeal to the masses, and it has to appeal to the pleasure centers to get you wanting to consume it more. Whether it's a true addiction or not is another issue, but as an addictive behavior, does it really fit into the equation? There's potent and sweetening effect of the substances used. You got to balance that against potential bitterness, though, and lingering aftertaste. So to accomplish this as a commercial proprietary blend, 2 or more artificial sweetening substances may be used as well as other ingredients to improve the overall experience. And that experience may not only be based on sweeteners, but you also have to make the product not cake up. It can't clump. It needs to be powdery to be used. And certain sweeteners are used in baking as a substitute for sugar quite readily because of that. And we'll talk more about topics like that through the lecture. But what about that product? Is it adulterized through this hybridization? Is it really the product that it is advertised to be? What is the public seeing? This came to me as a year or two ago when I was looking at a product my wife bought with monk fruit, and I looked at it and saw it had everything else in the world, probably very little monk fruit in it. I had to research it and tell her, well, just don't jump to conclusions based on marketing. What does the consumer really know? Because what if a filler comprises 95 to 99% of a product, such as maltodextrin, and it's a claimed sweetener that's supposed to be non-nutritive? But the non-nutritive aspect is so potent in sweetness that it may not require much serving and weight, and those other components are needed for weight and volume. And they may also have a dietary effect. So is it really non-nutritive? If it also has that as a component. We'll talk more about that as we look at individual sweeteners. But there are other additives such as silica as an anti-caking agent, but they seem to be way down the volume compared to like dextrose and maltodextrin and some of these products. So the additional substances may not seem to have adverse effects in small quantities. But like the reasoning, and think about this as if you're a medical professional or even a consumer. Years ago, Tylenol or Sweeteners was in all kinds of products. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down the page here. And there's many over-the-counter products could lead to overdosing. I actually had a nurse that was a patient, and he was somebody that had hepatitis C, and he died of a Tylenol overdose. He had cumulative effect there. And he was a medical professional. What about patients that were unaware, containing numerous products simultaneously? Because Tylenol was put into all kinds of cold products. And if you take Tylenol straight up, you may have not realized that acetaminophen was in these other products. And think about that in terms of food. The same things can happen. If additives also contribute to intestinal inflammation, and that can be an inconvenient side effect, what about the health adverse effects as it changes the microbiota of gut mitochondria as you're consuming it from many different sources, the cumulative effect? And here's that chart we were talking about that you can see on the screen. perhaps it might be too small to look at all the detail, but it's showing all the different artificial sweeteners. And then at the top of the chart, it's trying to correlate the timeline there of the introduction of artificial sweeteners and inflammatory diseases of the bowel. So as we talked about, I think it's a little more complicated than that, but at least that chart gives you an inkling of some of the thought process. And the general public may not know why. I certainly am subject to intestinal distress from a lot of these products, but it doesn't mean everyone is, or we're all different. So before we go on to the branding and the potential for misleading branding, I'm going to pause one again for additional check-ins. This is AA4FL looking for additional check-ins. Okay, none heard. This is the grand rounds and they are net. I'm checking in those that are on NetLogger and are listening in, but I'll also assure you that you don't have to be a Medical Amateur Radio Council member to participate. We make these discussions available to all amateurs. They benefit everyone, not just amateurs. We're recording it for Zoom, put it on YouTube as well. So we'd like to get the word out. The world sees issues and subjects through different lenses, and we're obviously, as Medical Amateur Radio Council members, come from different fields, many of us in health-related fields, although we have members of the general public as well. And the purpose of this net is to have discussions on HF. It's because of the vagaries of 20-meter propagation that's not always possible to have roundtable discussions. I encourage those of you who are not already on digital nets and don't have digital equipment. On March 28th, we're going to have a Grand Rounds of the Year session. We're specifically going to introduce you to ways that you could very affordably get onto digital radio using as simple as a dongle, $100 product that allows you to circumvent the different proprietary digital modes of buying individual radios as an introduction to digital radio, knowing that you'll want to also do things with live communication later that's only available to amateurs. And that will be our Zoom session on March 28th. And we look forward to you participating, because when we have our digital net, it's true roundtable. Everybody can hear each other. It's not just the people in the Southeast hoping the Midwest and out West hears us, or international. It's true. We even have check-ins from Japan. It's very late in the evening in Japan. We have our nets, and we're considering doing more digital nets in the future because of the qualities. We'd really like to see members embrace digital technology. Not that we're going to discontinue the Grand Rounds of the Year. We're not. Let's move on to the branding or the part. Okay, we have a question. Go ahead with the question.
This is N3IM. You keep saying March 28th.
Can you send that question over the air also, please?
You keep saying March 28th for the digital stuff. That's last weekend. That's last week.
Okay, I'm sorry, April, not March. You're right. It's the I think it's the last one in April. Thank you for correcting me. I'm getting older. Please excuse me. That's the excuse I use when I'm covering clinic. If I've got 10 patients being seen, and one of the students asked me, I said, well, I'm getting older. If I don't get back to you, I'm working with somebody else. I use the age as a distraction, as an excuse. That's one of the advantages of getting a little bit older. Thank you for pointing that out, Keith. But going on to are there any other comments though? Because we do have a session going either on HF. You can ask questions. You can ask on NetLogger, and you can also ask through the Zoom session. Any other questions before I move on? Or make a call to AA4FL. Okay, not copying anything right now. We'll continue on and have plenty of time for discussion. So what about branding? Is it misleading when an advertised artificial sweetener only has a small portion of the overall product by weight? As considered, please mute yourself if you're on Zoom, by the way. If you're not transmitting, please mute yourself. But is it misleading? Is that considered adulteration? That's a term we talked about greatly recent nets. So additives are often used in combination to avoid the use of sucrose or table sugar, but what if you have dextrose, which is a monohydrate form of D-glucose? It's a natural monosaccharide and a carbohydrate, a simple sugar also derived from corn or wheat. Or what if you had maltodextrin in the product? And that's botanically sourced carbohydrates. They're digestible. So it's nutritive. It's low-sweet saccharide polymers consisting of glucose units, primarily linked, and they have a chemical structure here that follows. But what if those were included in artificial sweeteners? Are they? We'll start to look at some of those details. So these are considered to be non-nutritive artificial sweeteners. But if they have another agent in it, are they non-nutritive? I mean, the whole point of having something that's non-nutritive is it to not be digestible, to not have a physiologic effect, or there may be a neurobiochemistry effect, which we're talking about. But what about diabetics and sugar alcohols? I mean, sugar alcohols naturally occur in small quantities, but they can also be produced. They can be synthetic. They don't contain alcohol or sugar. They're called sugar alcohols. They're a type of carbohydrate with a chemical structure similar to sugar. Some occur naturally, as we mentioned, but most of the ones found in packaged products are manufactured. So what about diabetics that are consuming? I mean, what's the purpose of sugar alcohol? Obviously, to give the feeling of sweetness, to make it a palatable and attractive food to consume. But are they partially digestible? And what if they are partially digestible? What if intestinal distress? Again, if you're on Zoom, please mute if you're on Zoom, because I don't have the ability to do it while I'm sharing here. But if they're partially digestible, does that give you intestinal distress from that? I mean, isn't that an issue? It is for me if I have too much of that, maybe not for everyone. But according to a study here, the major goals in management of diabetes to maintain optimal control of high blood glucose level and hypoglycemia, and dietary modifications was the most recommended treatment modalities for diabetic patients, and the use of food sweetened with sugar alcohols, such as xylitol, sorbitol, mannitol, lactocol. It just goes on. Erythritol, which you'll see in one of the products here, has brought the escalating interest in recent years. This is a quote. Since some sugar alcohols do not rise plasma glucose as they're partially digested and metabolized, but that doesn't mean, again, that they won't have an effect on intestinal distress. We'll talk about gastrointestinal distress again as we go and look at individual items here. So that research paper is available through the link. That quote is a small excerpt from it. I'm going to go down to the next page of the presentation. Hope you're enjoying the presentation. I hope you're finding this to be effective, and we'll be able to refer back to the Zoom session later. Here's a chart of some of the types of sugar alcohols. Now, I will mention the xylitol from a dental perspective because it's very common in sugar-free gums. Now, it is toxic to dogs. So if you leave your gum on the table and a dog consumes it, that can cause failure. I'm trying to remember his kidney or liver, but regardless, it's fatal to the dogs. And it's not uncommon to find that a dog gets a hold of a pack of gum and it becomes a fatality, certainly very sick. So that's one additional aspect of a sugar alcohol that I thought I'd mention from a dental perspective, something we had to make the patients aware of. We knew they were using xylitol products. And in dentistry, of course, we're trying to combat caries and dental caries and dental decay. And so we also encourage artificial sweeteners for that reason. Gum has the additional effect of causing the same reason dental decay is caused by sugared gums, because you're pumping the sugar into the top of the grooves of the teeth, into areas that make it very concentrated. Well, when you use an artificial sweetener, it takes away the nutritive issue, and that if the artificial sweetener doesn't contain something else that's fermentable, then it also has an action of pumping food out and can be cleansing. So getting into the non-nutritive sweeteners and talking back to those years when we were young, maybe the 1970s and 80s, probably remember cyclamates being discussed because it's still approved for use in over 55 countries, Canada for tabletop use, banned in the US in 1969, 1970. And this was something that was very common in my house, sugar-free soda that had cyclamates in it. But it was a risk of concern for bladder cancer. So those studies have led to banning. They're partially resolved, and some of the other sweeteners are subject to the same considerations like saccharin. And but they have not approved cyclamates back for reintroduction into the U.S. marketplace. But why? There was a concern about cancer risk. So, why was there a cancer risk? Well, based on animal studies. So other questions remain with animal studies, how pertinent they are in humans, just because a rat gets cancer. What about therapeutic index? I mean, think about drugs. We talked about Tylenol. How much has to accumulate in your system? What about dosing? Everything that has a therapeutic benefit also has a risk associated with it. Even water does. You can't just drink unlimited amounts of water and tolerate it. So you have to also consider the world in that complicated reality. The toxicity is a potential for just about anything, and how that transpires in the science for banning foods. Well, the FDA, I guess, has to determine that wisdom. But what about saccharin products like Sweet and Low when the labels are below? So the research raises concerns of the potential intestinal effects. In the bladder risk cancer, was that proven in humans? Obviously, if it was, it wouldn't be on the marketplace. But again, there's animal models have relevance in humans. They're found in the market in the context of it be a drug, but its therapeutic index be safe to use for dose dependent. Now, I couldn't find the statistics on it, but I seem to remember that one of the sweeteners, perhaps it was cyclamates, the study was, if you had 600 cans of soda a day sweet, you might be at risk for bladder cancer. And I don't know if that's true or not, or hearsay, but that's the types of arguments that have to be looked at. So as you look at the carbohydrate value here, all you really see on saccharin, on Sweet and Low saccharin. No, there's dextrose in it. I've got my mouse right over it. So even that, there's also anti-caking agents in it as well, silicates, cream of tartar. So there's other components to it. But if it had dextrose, and dextrose was a nutritive sweetener, is it really an artificial sweetener, or is it adulterated and hybridized? And that's Sweet and Low type products. We're not talking about any one particular product line that just happens to be manufactured of saccharin. There's many, many manufacturers. Actually, to the point that competing products are also in pink packets. So when you go to a restaurant, you ask for the pink stuff. They know what that is. But as we go into sucralose, which is very popular in baking, probably because it acts very much like sugar in baking, it's popular. It's subject to some of the same issues. What are the clinical investigation show on cardiometabolic health? There's a study there for that. But again, look at the ingredients. We're looking at maltodextrin here as the first ingredient. Now, granted that the sucralose may be much more potent, and that's the reason to get the volume there. But on the other hand, if the greatest volume is something that's considered to be nutritive, is it really a non-nutritive artificial sweetener? That's not for me to answer. That's a question to ponder. Again, we're not making commentary about any products. We're just opening up the consideration for you as a consumer to investigate this more on your own. So aspartame into the equal product line, does that have similar effects? Does it have the same effects? There's some links there that if you get the research document, you can read deeper into it. But again, look at the considerations. Dextrose with maltodextrin before the aspartame, the actual non-nutritive component, and other issue enclosures as well. So same question for you to further inquire about. This is just alerting you to the potential and that you should investigate it. We're not making any medical conclusions here. What about naturally occurring non-nutritive sweeteners? Things like stevia leaf extract. I mean, people buy these products and they think they're getting stevia. I mean, are you? Here's one that's called, that stevia is in the name of some of these products. If you go to the store, even if you go into like a Walmart and look at the product lines, you'll see a lot of them say there's stevia or Splenda right on the product, but are they? Is that all they are? I mean, look at the contents here. Here's got one of the sugar alcohols in this particular product that we have down here. We've got two competing labels, so I'm not sure we're looking at the same product. Perhaps I've conflated them, but we're looking at definitely, regardless of having different components that are not all the artificial, non-nutritive sweetener. And what if we come into other sweeteners that are also naturally occurring, things that are extracts, such as monk fruit, and even that particular product line. I've got a link here to the launch, a couple of different products, and that's what that was about. It's two different products. Let's go back to here. Just forgotten. There's two different links there, and it says which one is on the left and which one's on the right. Two different products that are based on stevia. Same thing here for monk fruit. So again, the same type of added ingredients, sugar alcohols on both of these products. And we talked about sugar alcohols and intestinal distress, but also what effect do these sweeteners have on the receptors in your body? Are the receptors also stimulated, the same ones for sweetness that have some of the effects of sugar on the body? And I'm going to pause one before we talk about sugar itself. Before we ask for questions, are there any additional check-ins? Make your call to AA for a phone right around the air. Okay, are there any questions, first of all, on HF radio? If you have a question you'd like to ask on HF radio, go ahead and ask at this time. It's AA 4. Any questions on Zoom? Go ahead and unmute and ask the question. Okay, no questions or comments. Let's go down and look at sucrose. I mean, we could look at the, oh my gosh, the biochemistry of all this and the metabolism in the process of metabolizing these sugars is complicated. Jerry is here with us at 4TSC, both the Zoom session as well as on the end. He and I spoke about this morning. We studied this 40 or 50 years ago. Krebs cycle and ATP. We need a refresher on the science. The last few pages here look at those metabolic processes. But what is table sugar actually? So it's a disaccharide. It has two simpler sugars, glucose and fructose, one of each. And there's the chemical formula. But that composition is it consists of those two molecules connected in natural sources. White cane sugar, beet sugar. And what happens when it hydrolyzes? What does it yield? Fructose and glucose. So what's more harmful? Well, we start thinking of a glycemic index where we're concerned about glucose if you're diabetic, and if a glycemic index says that glucose is 100, what's the glycemic index of something like table sugar? So I think it's 65 because half of it is glucose, which is 100, and fructose is fruit sugar is much lower. It might only be 25%. So it actually can be less harmful than some other sweeteners. But it's sweet stuff commonly used in our coffee baking and other culinary delights. But is it addictive? There's an article linked here, and I've quoted some of the article in conclusion from an evolutionary perspective. Scroll down here. I mean, we know that it's of interest to have inherent desire for food and for survival, but in some people, especially obese and bulimic patients, that can have a negative effect, and you can read the details on the screen here as well. Look at the original article for it. But again, we're talking about aggregate. And there's evidence that sugar can be addictive. And manufacturers, whether it be intentional or not intentional, I mean, this is what's happening. If you start using, for whatever reason, why these products might be considered to be addictive, and there may be different components of products and prepared foods, not foods that are unprocessed, but processed foods, and start throwing a lot of ingredients that even there's a further aggregate effect. So just consider that. There's a case, as Jerry said before, moderation. And as you're using non-processed foods, you can control what you're getting. I don't know the detail that you can investigate a process for to know exactly what you're getting. But what about naturally occurring sweeteners? What about honey? In the glycemic index of honey and the caloric content is not that different from sugar. It's you can see the calories here in comparison on the screen to a tablespoon of honey versus that of sugar. And its content is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. So maybe that's a little bit of an advantage, but not a whole lot of change. And there's no fats, honey, that's good. There's trace amounts of protein, but not significantly to contribute to your daily protein requirements. And we did cover an entire session on honey on the Grand Rounds, and we did discuss the regional honeys from different areas might have different advantages medically. Dave, who's with us today, Can Zero S, talked about Maluka honey during the Vietnam War and how it was used on mooncakes. That particular honey from New Zealand had components that accelerated wound healing. And that's not necessarily true for all honeys, but the reason why is, the bees take the nectar from different flowers, and if you're in a local area, well, you tend to get a reflection of that. And we're not going to go into all the details about honey, but that is available for anyone who would like to review the web stream of that particular recording. Go to our Ether. If you're not a Marco member, look at marco-ltd.org. Look at the section for the Ether newsletter. And there's links to all those in that last edition of the newsletter. It was April 1st. But in summary, what fructose initially seems to consume ATP, we're talking about ATP comparison to glucose. So we're going to go into the biochemistry of this on the next page when we actually look at the two and the ability to create energy. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the metabolic and cellular energy dynamics, but there is a Krebs cycle. There's a cycle of mitochondria, how energies get into cells. There's a relationship between sucrose and blood sugar and these other sugars. Maybe not the non-nutritive ones, but again, we said that they're adulterated. So we don't know exactly what we're getting. At least research, you might want to do research into finding that out. This shows you some of the actual processes. I'm just scroll through it very slowly, and I highlighted a few areas that are important. These are all the different links here if you want to research the topic. It's interesting that this was created by AI. This is Big Copilot. You can even see the links here that it created. So it's the future of the world. It's going to get more specificity with time. And does fructose produce more ATP than glucose? And again, this is the ability. It's a different mechanism. So you can go through that to see potentially which creates more energy. And the point that I'm trying to make here is if you look at the energy cycle, you start having more energy than you need. What does your body do with the extra energy? Do you gain weight? Why? Do you get fat? Is that why? Do we store the extra energy in fat, which you can recover energy from later if you're in a period of fasting or not having enough calories? And then that fat gets released back and they're available through the Krebs cycle for ADP for cellular metabolism. And as you go through all this, and you find that you want to research it, it's all available here for you. That's not the purpose of our lecture today. I'm not trying to make everybody nutritive biochemists, but complicated subject, and we don't want to give simple answers. That's the end of the presentation for today. I hope you found it interesting. We're going to find out how effective it is having it recorded here on the Grand Rounds. I'm sorry, on Zoom, as we put it on YouTube later for public consumption. So I'm going to ask first for any questions or comments on the high frequency end of the 20-meter end of the net. Go ahead and ask your questions. This is the 84 fell from the Grand Rounds data.
Jay, if you can hear me, I do have a comment in Portuguese.
Okay, for those of you that are not amateur radio operators listening in on Zoom, you could hear that noise in the background with no transmissions of questions. Are there any questions on the Zoom end? You can go ahead and unmute and make comments or ask questions. I think Jerry's ready to unmute here. So let me turn it over to Jerry first, and for TSC by way of Zoom. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, if you can hear me, I'm not sure whether I'm going to come through on the radio side or the other side, but in any case, the comment I would make is that people respond to a certain level of sweetness, and I've observed that if you abandon the source of sweetness for a period of time, when you go back to it, it doesn't take as much source of sweetness to give you that same sensation. So it may be a way of dealing with the addictiveness that you're talking about of these sugars. And maybe it's something that we can advocate in medicine for people who are subject to or are pre-diabetic. Back to you, Jay.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. I was able to pick up your audio on the Zoom by manipulating the volume so that she recorded on the recording. Thank you for the comments and the question. And yeah, well, it's complicated, and as health professionals, we do counsel patients, or certainly if I had asked earlier about diabetic neuropathy from a few from you, Jerry, and also from Barry here, who's also an ophthalmologist. Dave might want to comment on that if he's still listening. KF2M. And what do you do if you have a patient that has diabetic neuropathy? So that comes in a twofold question. And I mentioned earlier with Jerry on the digital net, as a dentist, often I would find periodontal disease would rapidly onset in individuals that had no history of it. And that would also always raise my concerns of whether or not they'd become diabetic, and I certainly can ask questions of their medical history. But at the end of the day, it was alerting them to talk to their physician. But we had an unexplained reason for a change in their disease pattern, which of course, anytime you have an immunosuppressive disease can also be an issue. So it's not my place to do a medical diagnosis, but it was my place to alert them to a potential problem. So Jerry and Barry and Dave, as physicians, I would assume that occasionally you found somebody that they had a neuropathy that maybe wasn't diagnosed. And at that point, you can suspect diabetes as a source and refer them for nutritive counseling. Obviously, if they already came in to be evaluated because you knew they were diabetic, the A1C would probably be monitored, have that discussion with them. But at the end of the day, there are individuals out there that don't know their A1C or don't go to the physicians on a regular basis. So Jerry, if you'd like to make a comment about that on Zoom, I'll turn the mic back over to you at 4TSC, AA4FL.
Okay, A4FL and 4TSC. I think that the problem has to do with the lack of publicity of the value of the A1C, and people are focused only on the immediate sugar levels, and it's just a shot in time. But if you want to look at what your average blood sugar level is over the past 3 months, that's the A1C, and people are just not aware of it. And I think that gives you a better reflection of what your average threat is to potential diabetes. A4FL and 4TSC.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Jerry, is interesting in that, there's a great segment, again, that does not see, the population does not see a physician on a regular basis. They may not even know their fasting glucose level. I mean, and those of us that are at risk for diabetes that do check at home, it's not a difficult thing to do, but it doesn't mean that we do. So to make that jump to what an A1C is even more problematic for those people that just don't take care of themselves. So as a screening tool, I would think there's some wisdom in that. I'm going to pass to Barry for any comments. WB1FFI by way of Zoom. Barry, if you do it by, okay, you could go ahead and do it by HF if you prefer. Go ahead and I'll turn the volume up.
WB1FFI. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to make some comments there's a couple of things. Jay used the term neuropathy. I think you meant to use the term retinopathy with regard to the eye finding. When we do exams on patients that are not known diabetic, and we discover what could be diabetic retinopathy, or usually there are small hemorrhages, there may be leakage, like exudates, microaneurysms, and so forth. These share commonality with other ischemic diseases. So if the patient is not a known diabetic, we would certainly refer them to a primary care doctor for evaluation too. Also, prevention and other ischemic causes of retinopathy. So that's just an important distinction to make regarding finding asymptomatic changes in the retina. One of the last things, because I raised the issue on the Zoom, I did discover a way to correct the mirroring issue. I went into the video settings, which is what you go into the video, the up arrow, it says video settings, and then that opens up a window, and there is a choice actually to unclick mirroring. So that's the answer to that one. It was an easy one. So thank you, Jay, and back to you, AA4FL B1FFI.
Okay, thank you, Barry, and thank you for correcting the retinopathy issue. You can tell that dentist isn't necessarily the only participant here. Appreciate the correction from the misspeak. That's yeah, a little bit of conflation or unconflation on my part. We also have with us Andy by Zoom, WJAB. Andy, do you have some comments you'd like to make by Zoom? We'll wait for you to unmute. There you go. Go ahead.
Okay. No, not too much. I noticed that we have less latency with Zoom and HF radio than we do with the regular marcoaudio.net. I mean, so it's very, very minimal. It's there, but it's minimal. So, but pretty much agree with all the comments. You know, the artificial sweeteners and the processed food issue is more than just artificial sweeteners, and there's going to be more on that over a period of time. You know, I have a granddaughter who has inflammatory bowel disease. I have chronic pancreas issues, and we're both on a very similar diet that tells us to avoid processed foods. It tells us to avoid animal-based protein if we can. It's not totally, but at least make it less, make more plant-based as well. And those are just generalizations. There's a whole bunch of other things too. But that's all I have. So back to Jay.
Well, thank you for that perspective. It's an important perspective. You're right. We just need to be sensitized to pay attention to what's going on in the world. And as consumers, we have the option or availability to do investigations. So we don't have to necessarily be affected by a product in the way that marketing intends to. I was watching the Final Four yesterday with my son, and my son and I are both FDM, looking at all the food commercials. That's we're talking about it. Hey, look at that. I think we better, be careful, because there weren't too many things advertised that were healthy. I didn't see any advertisements for oranges yesterday. Maybe in football, Super Bowl, the avocados come on there, but it's usually processed foods or fast foods or alcohol related. Of course, now we have the added benefit of all this sports betting being advertised, a nice wholesome concept that's new to the world here. So Keith, N3IM, would you like to come in through Zoom or HF? Either one would be fine. I'll pick up your audio.
Yeah, Jay. No, I don't have any additional comments. I know that the artificial sweeteners can lead to increased insulin resistance, which doesn't help diabetics at all. It also can contribute to obesity through the craving for the sweet, because of the dopamine release that sugar gives you. Also, we have the problem of cardiovascular disease, hypertension being associated with artificial sweetener use, depending on the amount of sweetener used. I find it interesting to note that another reason for the not smoking campaign may be the fact that the lab tech who was smoking in his lab and picked up the cigarette and tasted the sweetness and found cyclamate, is how cyclamate was found. So anyway, that's just an offside comment. Miss Cynthia, I am back to you guys.
Oh my gosh, I did not even realize that. You know, those of us that grew up in the 1960s and 50s, I remember even things like the Flintstones, the old black and white advertisement for cigarettes where Fred's lying back in a hammock and smoking a cigarette. So, you know, it's complicated, and some of us remember the Marlboro Man too. So that's funny that you mentioned cigarettes having a connection to artificial sweeteners. I had no idea. Are there any comments on the Zoom end? Bill, KC9CS is with us. Bill, do you have any questions or comments? Go ahead. Okay, nothing heard. Perhaps Bill had stepped away. If there's no additional comments, I'll ask for any late check-ins here on the HF side before we bring the net to a close. This is AA4FL for the Grand Rounds on the Internet, looking for additional check-ins. There's no additional check-ins. So thank you for everyone that joined us today for the Grand Rounds on the Internet. Next week, Jerry, would you like to just briefly tell us about the program for next week, which is going to be transmitted from your QTH and for TSC and FL? You're good.
Okay. We're going to have a guest speaker who is a physician who started out by doing pediatric surgery, and through his own personal interaction with a psychologist or psychiatrist, I'm not sure, he discovered that there was a treatment for neuroses, and the neuroses being things like fear of flying. And so he's going to address his journey and how he discovered that there is a method of dealing with these issues with short-term therapy rather than with intensive short-term therapy, rather than with long-term psychiatric care over several years, which in his hypothesis generates income for pharmaceutical industries and is easy for psychiatrists to dole out. And he thinks that there's a better way of dealing with these short-term, in a short-term way, with things like neuroses and fears and other things. And so that's what he will address, his journey and what he thinks might be helpful going forward. Should be interesting. Back to you.
Okay, and for TSC, for those that weren't on the Zoom session, was talking about next week, the discussion on neuroses that's going to take place on the Grand Rounds on the Air and Net, and in the hypotheses of the individual that's going to present. And, you know, it's somewhat corollary to some of the marketing that we're talking about now in industrialization. If you talk about the philosophy of consumption and society and the sociology of it, if you really want to nerd out on those aspects of the discussion points, that's something that happens in my house because I've got somebody, son that teaches about university level. I'm going to say 7-3 now and bring the net to a close. Thank you for everybody that participated in the Grand Rounds on the Internet. We're going to turn this over to the general public for the frequency. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, and then I'll be making that available. Hopefully everything worked out correctly. Technologically, I'll create that as a YouTube video, and then also share that amongst Marco members. Anyone that's listening on HF, it's not a Marco member. Again, AA4FL, just contact me through my QRZ email address, and I'll make everything available to you as well. This is AA4FL for the Medical Image Radio Council Grand Rounds of the Internet. Thank you for joining us for this net that we hold every Sunday at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern. Most Sundays, occasionally we don't have. And 7-3, till next week.